Okay.
Okay.
All yours.
Okay, Rita, can you tell me something about yourself?
Well, I'm retired now. I've been retired since 1988. But before that, I had a lovely job. I was the PR for the Tame division of Severn Trent Water. A job that I thoroughly enjoyed. And then when they were getting ready for privatisation, we had a new manager who didn't really think my job would be required. So I asked for early retirement and he gave it me in 3 days. I found it a little bit, a bit of a shock because it was a job that I thoroughly enjoyed. But I don't regret, retiring because I've carried on more or less what I was doing as a PR when I was at Severn Trent.
Can you describe your early working life and how you came to be involved with Severn Trent?
Well, it really goes back to the 1960s. I worked in the engineers department of the Upper Tame Drainage Authority, and then I was asked then if I would do PR work, especially with visitors on sites, you see, which again I enjoyed. And then in '74, when that side of the industry and the clean water, which was Birmingham's water department, amalgamated, then of course I was asked if I'd do both jobs, and I did, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. But of course, to do a job properly, you must get really involved, and then I started to come up to Elan Valley and visit all the water treatment works. And then of course, once you've been to the valley, that's when the interest starts. You never stop coming, do you? Well, I don't anyway. I think it's wonderful.
What did your job entail?
Mainly going into schools and speaking to children about the water from the valley to Birmingham, and it was surprising the number of children and teachers that were quite unaware of it. And then I would bring visitors here and take them on the works. It was eat, sleep and drink it, but as I say, I thoroughly enjoyed every minute of it. I met lovely people and did lovely things, you see.
Can we just stop it there, please? Right, are you all right for sound?
Okay. Go.
Okay, Rita, can you tell me a bit about yourself?
Well, I'm retired now. I retired in 1988. But before that, I had a wonderful job working at Severn Trent Water Authority. And I had, as I say, a lovely job. I was the public relations officer for the whole of the Tame division. A job that I was sorry to leave, but I've carried on doing it and I'm still happy. Yes.
What did your job entail?
What did my job entail? Well, I visited schools. I had... sorry, I've gone wrong, haven't I?
That's all right.
What did my job entail? Well, I went to visit schools. I visited groups, probus clubs, all sorts of places, and just told them about Birmingham and its wonderful water and how it got there from Wales. And I met some lovely people, very interesting people too, yes.
So had you always worked with Severn Trent, or how did you come to be involved with the job that you ended up doing?
I didn't always work at Severn Trent. When I married, I came to live in Birmingham and got a job with the Upper Tame Drainage Authority, which dealt with the dirty water, to put it politely, in the engineers department. And they asked me if I would do some PR work, taking visitors on works, etc. And I said yes, and it grew from that. And then in '74, the water industry was reorganised, and the Birmingham Water Department and the Upper Tame, we all amalgamated. And then, of course, I was asked if I would do the same type of work involving the clean water side. And of course, I said yes, I would, I'd love it.
You okay, Ray?
Mm-hmm. Do you want to get inside?
Yeah. Can you pass me that?
Can I ask you how many years you worked for? Now, what was it? Severn Trent, wasn't
Severn
it?
Trent, yes.
Yeah, and if you could say I worked for whatever, and then we're going
Yes.
to privatisation.
Okay.
Okay. So how many years did you work for Severn Trent?
Oh, almost 25 years. And then we were getting ready for privatisation, and we had a new young manager, and he said he didn't really, didn't really think that my job would be necessary. And I thought, I'm not going to get on very well with it, doing something I've never enjoyed doing. So I asked for early retirement, and I had quite a shock. He gave it me in 3 days. But as I say, I left, and I miss the company, I miss people, because I'd always worked with so many. But I've sort of carried on doing the same type of work, and I thoroughly enjoyed, and I can do it at my own pace and my own leisure, you see, which is nice.
And now, can you tell me about your find in the skips?
Oh, how did I find all the history? Well, getting ready for privatisation, you see, they just got rid of everything, not just people, but all the history of Birmingham's water department. Photographs, books, letters, correspondence, going back to the early 1800s.
Go on, Lois.
Okay, let's go.
Right, okay.
Right. Around.
Okay. So can you tell me about your find, Rita?
Tell you how I found all the history of Birmingham's water. Well, when we were getting ready for privatisation, they didn't only get rid of people, they got rid of all the history connected with Birmingham's Water Authority. It was stored in Lionel Street, which is in Birmingham, and they just put everything in a skip and burnt it. There were books, letters, correspondence, photographs. Yes, maybe some of it wasn't very interesting, but there was a tremendous amount that was. And when I realised what they were doing, I asked if I could have it, and they said yes. So I just brought these sacks home and then looked at them at my leisure. And from that, I've learned a tremendous about the valley and how it was and how people lived when these dams were being built.
So you've always been interested in history?
Oh, I've always loved history, yes.
And
yes.
When you started working as a PR person,
Yes.
did you have to learn a lot about the dams?
Yes, I did. I used to come up here and speak with Mr. Bennett, who was then the superintendent on the works, and he was most kind and very, very helpful. And of course I learnt a lot from him. And then I used to go out to Franklin Works, where the water is delivered to, for a better expression, from here, and the men were very, very helpful and kind there. I think that's the only way you can learn, is straight from the horse's mouth, really, to be told directly. Yes.
So you're a great admirer of those Victorian pioneers?
Oh yes. I find it difficult to find words to express how I feel. I think it was just tremendous that a man, Mr. Manzer, came and built railways in Wales, and then he saw these lovely valleys and told Birmingham about them and said, you can build dams and store water and then send it to Birmingham by gravity feed. What vision. And the fact that the council in those days trusted him and gave him the power and authority to do it. And it's all there, isn't it? It's wonderful.
So it was some years later, after the railway was built, that the dams were started to be built?
Yes, as I say, Manzer, he built the railways, and of course he could see the potential, knowing that Birmingham needed a water supply, and he told them that this was the right thing to do. They had discussions with him and his brother-in-law, a man by the name of Rawlingson, I think it was, many years before, and I think it was hit on the head. It was a waste of time and not a good feasible thing to do. And then again he got back to them and they accepted it, you see, and trusted him, and he designed the dams, the water supply and the Franklin Works.
Can you tell me a little about Mr. Chamberlain?
Mr. Chamberlain was a man who came from Highbury in London, and his father sent him to Birmingham to look after his own interests, that he'd invested some money in a firm that made screws, Geskin and Nettlefolds, and he sent his son to look after his affairs. And of course when he arrived in Birmingham he fell in love with it like I did and lived there for the rest of his life. He became a councillor, then the Lord Mayor, and then of course he became an MP. He was the poor man's friend. He did a tremendous amount for Birmingham. Education, banking, the TSB Bank, but my interest really is in the fact that he gave Birmingham their water supply, because in those days it was all private water companies, so only the rich could really have water. And Mr. Chamberlain said, this is not right. Poor people should have water, and if we can do that, supply them with a good water supply, the disease and the squalor will disappear. So what he did was have all the terrible back-to-back houses removed, built the city, that little bit of it is still left, and then persuaded the councillors to buy the private water companies up, enabling the poor man to have water.
So they obviously purchased a large piece of land here in the Elan Valley.
Yes, they bought 70 square miles of the Elan Valley, so that belonged to Birmingham, and all the water, all the rain that fell was Birmingham's. But of course, it isn't so. Things have changed tremendously since then, and we've gone back to privatisation. We've done a complete circle, haven't we?
So from the literature that you were able to find, or from anything that you know,
Yes.
what was the local reaction? Did the people agree to it?
People in Wales didn't like it. Obviously, to see that the village of Elan was going underwater and the sheep walks were disappearing, they didn't like it. But the people in Birmingham didn't like it. There were public meetings, letters to the press. It was never going to work, and what a waste of money. But those that thought it was a good idea stood their ground and won in the end. And of course it's proved it. It's brought tourism to the area here in Wales, and it's also given Birmingham a water supply.
Can you tell me a little bit about how they compensated the farmers that they obviously had to build them new dwellings? Can you tell me about that?
Yes, they built new properties for them to live in. They still do, or did look after the area that belonged to them extremely well. Everybody was very well looked after, the lovely houses to live in. They gave them all their sheep walks back. There was a forestry part, where they did wood felling and all that type of thing. Yes, I think it's improved the area. I think it's brought a lot, because prior to that it was lead mines and just sheep. And of course the lead mines didn't last for very, very long. And there was no industry really here, where I think it's brought a lot into the area.
So when you bring coach parties around, what's their general reaction?
Well, they changed their mind about paying their water rates for a start. They realise where their money goes, and they're just so proud. They're nearly all Birmingham people, of course, and they're so proud of what Birmingham did so many years ago. They think it's wonderful. Yeah.
So going back to the material that you found,
Yes.
can you think of anything that's particularly interesting?
Oh yes, I've got lots of things, particularly I think more so relating to the valley than maybe to Birmingham. But I found letters, one in particular that I shall treasure for the rest of my life, from General Booth of the Salvation Army, and he offers mattresses to be used in the Doss House, and it tells you they're made of seaweed, these mattresses, wrapped in American oilcloth that you can wash each day with Jace fluid. And Birmingham refused, and they said no, they will have proper beds to lie on and good facilities. And this is what Birmingham did. They looked after the navvy extremely well. When he arrived in the Doss House, he had a clean nightshirt and a bed and bed linen. It must have been wonderful. They thought they were in the Savoy, I would think, when you look back how they built the railways and the conditions that they lived in then. It must have been heaven for them. It was hard life, but I think that they found it very, very good compared with what they'd had previously.
Can you just tell me something about the village, from what you know about the suspension bridge, about the fact that the men could only go out over the bridge?
The village itself was all wooden houses, but they were built, all the houses were built to a very, very strict design and very well furnished. I mean, they had a proper kitchen, a real kitchen, and a real toilet with running water. OK, it may have been cold water, but it was clean, fresh water. And the lady of the house, she couldn't bring any of her possessions with her. Every house was furnished exactly the same, because the lady of the house could take in lodgers. So it meant that if a lodger moved from one house to the other, it wasn't the furnishings, it was obviously the lady's cooking that didn't meet his requirements. They looked after them extremely well. There was the local pub, which was then named the Canteen. There was recreation room, there was schools. Yes, I think they were extremely well looked after. And of course the bridge, the suspension bridge, is still here. And in the skip, in the rubbish, I found the bill, £19 for that bridge, yes. So from what I found in the skip, I've learnt a lot about how people lived here, the money they earned, and how it was spent as well.
You mentioned something about the entrances at the not the entrances, the cover at the school, rain cover.
Yes. In the original village, it was a wooden school, a wooden building, to, I suppose, the same as the houses, really. And then when the dams were completed and all the navvies dispersed, they began to build the village that you see today. And they built a new school. And in the report, it states for the new school that there will be a special cover for the young boys to play if it rained. Nothing for the girls, it was just for the boys, yes. And they decided who was going to live in which house. I can't remember the names of the people, but let's say, for instance, Mr. Smith couldn't live next door to Mr. Jones because their wives argued and there'd be rows. You know, they dispersed them around this village to keep peace and quiet, I suppose, but it was all very well thought out. Yes.
Okay.
Mr. Yerdy was appointed the engineer in charge of building the dams here in the valley. A very strange name. His father was a Greek diplomat, worked in Dublin and fell in love with a girl from Cork. But Mr. Yerdy was an extremely good engineer, but a very, very strict man. But then he had to be, didn't he, with all the navvies that he'd got. They were not all angels. No black and white. It was very, very strict. One of his junior engineers went into Rada for a pint, and when he came back he sacked him because it was not in keeping with his position. Another illustration, they felled the trees and the school children used them for seesaws, and he wrote a letter to the headmaster saying, please don't let the children use these trees again for a seesaw. And then a lot of the navvies, or the men that worked on the dams, lived from outlying areas, so they came in by train on a Monday, worked in the village and went home on a Saturday. Well, the train very often was late on a Monday morning bringing them to work into Rayada, and they asked if they could use the train from Rayada up into the valley, was carrying the materials. And Mr. Yerdy thought about it and had them checked out, and then he said no, he wouldn't. So that meant that those poor men arrived on a Monday morning, they'd missed their shift, they'd lost a morning's work, but he wouldn't give in. No, that was the rule, no passengers, and he wouldn't allow them to do it.
And what about some of the other engineers?
Well, I think of Mr. Atkinson. Mr. Atkinson was, again, he came from Ireland, from Dublin, and he built what I call the submerged dam, which is Carrickdee, the one by the church. And he was in Dublin, and his father was a linguist at the university there. His father could speak 20 languages. And this young man, Mr. Atkinson, fell in love with a doctor's daughter. But when he asked to get married, the doctor said yes, when you've got a respectable job. And he was a civil engineer out of work. And he waited 7 years. And then Mr. Yerdy gave him the job of building this lovely dam. So he goes to his young lady and asks her to marry him. Well, she'd waited so long, she didn't know whether she could. And her sister said to her, you must marry him. You know he plays the piano very well. Wonderful pianist. So she married him. And then she said, all the children I have, I will educate them myself. And I think she must have been a very good teacher. One became an architect, another one was a doctor, another one was an astronomer. They all did extremely well. And they gave all their children double-barrel names. And their eldest daughter, Margaret, she was given the name Margaret Yerdy Atkinson. Mr. Yerdy was her godfather. And how did I find out all this about this wonderful family? Well, Mr. Atkinson's daughter Margaret was the one that became a doctor, and when she married she came to live in Birmingham, and I met her daughter. So that's how I learnt all about him. And this I've found a lot in my job. People have told me other things, then I've met different people. I've learnt a lot, not just from reading the bits of paper in the skip, but from other people too.
Is that how you met Mr. Chitty?
I gave a talk to to a group in Birmingham, and I met this lovely lady, and she told me she recognised a photograph of a house that she had lived in as a girl here while the dams were being built. And her father had come from Birmingham and brought his wife and family, and they lived in Red a little while, and then when the wooden houses were built, the first village, they came and lived here, and their house was number 1. It was the one right by the bridge, and she lived there. And then when she married, she went back to Birmingham, you see, and lived with her husband there, and of course that's how I met her. And of course she was a mind of interest, and then she introduced me to her brother, Mr. Chitty, who is now 97, and he's just as wonderful as she was. And again, I've learnt lovely stories about the valley. Their father wasn't a very nice man, but then again, I think he was a typical man of his his time. He was a typical Victorian man. But when you chatted to them, their childhood and their life here in the valley was absolutely wonderful. And their father was the man in charge of the payroll. He paid the men every week, and where they went and collected their wages, their salary, is still there. The little stone building by the suspension bridge before you go into the visitor centre, that's where the men, all of them, had to stand on a Saturday. And he was a strict man, and he didn't like the men collecting their wages with dirty boots, and they used to stand there cleaning their shoes, rubbing them on their trousers before they went to collect their money. Yes.
Could you describe how the pipeline works? Because it's gravity fed, isn't it? So
Yes.
could you just explain how, once the water gets to the Royal Tower, exactly the route it takes?
Well, when the water in Cabin Dam, that water doesn't go to Birmingham. That all goes into the River Wye. But before it does, it goes through the turbine houses here by the visitor centre, and they generate electricity from it there. Then it goes onto the sand filters. Sorry, I've got that wrong. The water in Cabin Dam, that goes into the Wye. But the water that goes to Birmingham is taken out at the Royal Tower. That's by the church, by the submerged dam. And that takes the water out and then sends it down a tunnel to the sand filter beds, which are just above the village here. And there it goes through sand. There's so many feet of sand and so many feet of gravel, and they put lime in it to begin with because there's a lot of peat in the valley, and the peat would corrode the pipes. They're cast iron pipes, most of them, so they put the lime in and that removes the peat. Then the water goes through the sand for filtration, and the sand works like a tea strainer. It collects all the things we don't need in water, and then they put the fluoride in for children's teeth, and then the chlorine, and that's it. It goes down the pipeline. The distance from here, from the works to Frankley, it's almost 74 miles, and it's all gravity feed. And the marvellous thing about it is the fall is only 170 feet over that distance, and the water never sees daylight for 2.5 days until it gets to Frankley. And then it just goes through sand filters. There's no chemicals added at all. So Birmingham really does get beautiful water from the valley. Yes.
Talking about the present day, and from a personal point of view, do you think the privatisation was a good thing?
No, privatisation I think was wrong, really, in so many ways. You see, when you've got to think, if everybody's going to have a water meter, this is my own personal view, but to everyone have a water meter, they'll think, oh, shall I wash my hands now, or shall I do this with water? Whereas they can just turn the tap on, and I do feel that there's enough water in this country for everybody. They're very cautious about their gas and the electricity. Shall I turn it on? Shall I use it? And I don't think we should. I think water should be there for everybody. Okay, we do pay for it, and it's not cheap to some people. No, I was against privatisation. I don't think it was a good thing, and I think it's proved it in the last few years. It's money really to line other people's pockets. It doesn't really go back into the industry that it should go back into.
So can you tell me what you do at the moment? Now you're retired.
No, I've retired. Well, I'm not really retired. My husband's retired, but I haven't. But I go 2 or 3 times a week, I suppose, and speak to people, groups who invite me, and tell them about Birmingham's wonderful water supply, telling them about how people live, the navvies, how they work, the salaries they earned, etc. And then, of course, they say, will you please take us to the valley? And I bring them up. Roughly about, it varies, but I suppose once a month I bring a party up and we go round the valley. And if we're fortunate, we can get a key and go inside the Pengarrick Dam, which of course is the one that everybody likes. It's got windows in it. If the water's pouring over, well, that's an added bonus, because it's like looking through a lace curtain when the water's pouring over the top there. But it's a part of I think it's a wonderful part of England. Well, no, Wales, I should say, of Great Britain. That's correct, isn't it? Yes.
Do you want to repeat that?
Yes, I think I better.
I think it's
Oh dear, I really will put my foot in it, won't I?
that's fine. You just go,
Yeah.
I think.
I think that Elan Valley is the most beautiful part of Wales. To me, it's another wonder of the world. It's the 8th wonder of the world. I think it's beautiful. Yes.
So can you just tell me some of your future plans?
Well, my future plans are to go and retire in Devon, and everybody thinks I'm doing the wrong thing. My husband wants to go, so, you know, I feel I should go with him. And then, yes, I do want to go with him. That's not the wrong thing to say. But everybody says, oh, we shall miss you. You'll miss all these tours and visiting people. I'm sure I will. And I don't think the people in Devon will be particularly interested in what goes here, but you never know. But that's what I plan to do, and maybe do some of the hobbies that I've had to put on one side. I like playing the piano, which I don't get a great opportunity to do. I like doing bobbin lace, I like knitting, and of course I like reading, but I don't get these opportunities. So maybe when I do retire, that's what I'll do when I go to Devon. Yes.
Okay. All right. I'm going to ask you how long you've worked for them, and then you mentioned the privatisation.
Okay.
Okay. So how long did you work for Severn Trent Authority?
I worked in all for almost 25 years. And then when we were getting ready for privatisation, we had a new young manager who said that he didn't really think my job would be necessary. And I knew I would have a job, but it wouldn't maybe one that I was going to enjoy. So I asked for early retirement. And I had quite a shock, because he must have had the papers ready and he gave it me in 3 days. I was sad, a little bit, and I missed the people, because I'd been in contact with people all my working life. But now I'm quite happy, because I still do the same type of job, rather, but I do it at my own pace and when I feel like it, and I thoroughly enjoy it. I love it. Yes.
Okay, do you want to leave it there? And then if you want to